Rachel Reeves says she won't raise taxes to fuel her search for economic growth. She won't borrow either. But if the Chancellor had a walk-on song for her spring statement, it would probably be Tamla Motown's very first #1. Money don't get everything, it's true, but what it don't get, I can't use. Give me money. In truth, the Chancellor's in a hole. She says the Tories dug it. They say she needs to stop digging. Reeves needs to find billions to balance the books. But after cuts in winter fuel payments, international aid and welfare benefits, is her party running out of patience yet? 3 days to go to the Chancellor's biggest test since the last one. She said last year's budget was once in a parliament, but things have got worse again, and now it looks like there's billions of pounds of cuts coming. Can public services, the economy and her own party take it? We'll speak to Rachel Reeves. The current government blames the last one for much of the problems it faces. So what would the Tories do differently now? We'll speak to Shadow Chancellor Mel. And we'll be joined by the Liberal Democrats' Treasury spokesperson and Deputy Leader, Daisy Cooper. Plus, with us throughout the show, the political editor of The Spectator and soon to be the United States editor of The Times, Katie Balls, the broadcaster Daisy McAndrew, and the chief leader writer of The Observer and Guardian, columnist Sonia Soda. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. This morning, a major poverty think tank publishes research suggesting that British families will become poorer over the next 5 years, and that on present policies, households which are already at the bottom of the pile will fall even further behind. Of course, some people say that money isn't everything. Just weeks before he was assassinated in 1968, the presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy, famously told Americans that gross national product does not allow for, amongst other things, the health of our children, the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, or the intelligence of our public debate. He said it measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. But this week, the United Nations published its annual list of the happiest countries in the world. Britain was 23rd, ahead of America, France and Italy, but behind Finland, Canada and Germany. Awkwardly for Bobby Kennedy's admirers, 16 of the 22 countries happier than us were also richer per head than us. The hard fact is that people tend to be happier if they've got more money in their pockets. On Wednesday, the Chancellor's going to have to admit that the better part of a year into her government, there is still no growth in sight. And thus far, there's no sign that she's got anything up her sleeve to put a smile on the face of the nation. The spring statement is on Wednesday. It's likely to be a much bigger event than the Chancellor expected or hoped. We already know there'll be welfare cuts, and we're pretty sure there'll be billions more in spending cuts for so-called unprotected departments. That could be the likes of Justice or the Home Office. We spoke to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, a little earlier. Can we start with Heathrow? It must be embarrassing, Chancellor, to have our biggest airport knocked out by a fire in a single substation and then not have the capacity to divert flights to, let's say, Gatwick. Are you regretting the decision to put the final decision on a second runway at Gatwick off for 6 months?
We've given an in principle decision to expand Gatwick, as well as supporting expansion of a third runway at Heathrow. I think what's happened over the last couple of days...
put it off for 6 months.
Well, it's the first time that we've had an in-principle decision to expand Gatwick. That's been welcomed by Gatwick Airport and by the operators. We do need to expand airport capacity in the UK, and I think that what we've seen in the last couple of days shows how important that is, but also how important it is to build the resilience in our UK critical infrastructure, including our hub airport, Heathrow.
Well, I suppose the reason that I ask you that is that putting off the Gatwick decision by 6 months feels like another British way of doing infrastructure. We're going to promise it, but we're going to put it off again and again.
I don't...
What happened this weekend feels like another example, putting off infrastructure, and then we pay the price, as we did on Friday and Saturday.
We've given an in-principle decision to expand Gatwick. That has never happened before, although it's something that the airport has been asking for a long time. So we're not kicking this into the long grass. There's some work to be done to make sure that it can be done without all the judicial reviews that so often hold up infrastructure in the UK. And we've also made a commitment to have spades in the ground in this Parliament at Heathrow when we build a third runway there. So this government are getting on with the job, building the infrastructure, whether that is the digital infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, or indeed the 1.5 million homes that this country needs.
Okay.
We're backing the builders, not the blockers.
OK, well, I'm sure this is not the last time we're going to discuss that, but let's get on with what you're going to do this week, which is a spring statement. The Office of Budget Responsibility is going to slash its growth forecast, we hear. Some say by as much as a half. You have no fiscal headroom left. Just how serious is the country's financial situation?
I'm not going to preempt the Office of Budget Responsibility's forecast, but the world has changed. We can all see that before our eyes. And government are not inactive in that. We'll respond to the change and continue to meet our fiscal rules, but we're also shaping the new world, whether that's in the defence and security realm or indeed on the economy. I promised at the general election to bring stability back to the economy. As a result of that stability, interest rates have been cut 3 times since the general election. That's a far cry from the 11% inflation and the interest rate hikes that we saw under the previous government. And that's only been possible because we've put our public finances on a firm footing, and we've also put our public services on a firm footing, which is what I did in the budget last year.
This is a rather cheerful reading of the situation. Actually, inflation was on its way down when you came in. It's actually slightly ticking back up. But the point I really wanted to ask you about is to describe how serious you think it is. The Joseph Rowntree Trust Foundation today predicts a huge fall in living standards by the end of this Parliament.
I reject that.
You think they're just wrong?
I reject that. And the Office of Budget Responsibility will set out their forecast this week. Living standards in the last Parliament were the worst ever on record. The Office of Budget Responsibility forecast in October that living standards would increase at double the rate in this Parliament as they did in the last Parliament. They'll set out their updated numbers this week. But if you look at wages at the moment, wages are rising today at twice the rate of inflation. That is very different from what we saw under the previous government.
But just to be clear, you're saying that you simply don't think that living standards are going to fall. In fact, you're suggesting that they're rising now and they'll continue to rise. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm confident that we will see living standards increase during the course of this Parliament. What we've already seen in these last few months of the Labour government is a sustained increase in living standards. Next month, at the beginning of April, people on the national living wage will see a 6.7% increase in their wages, £1,400 more a year. That's only possible because of the stability that we have returned to the economy. And of course, those 3 cuts in interest rates from the Bank of England mean that mortgage rates are lower than they otherwise would have been. We've got to do more, absolutely, in terms of raising living standards. But this government have already got started in delivering our plan for change.
Well, look, there's you can say the picture you've just painted, but there's a different way of seeing this. Inflation isn't coming down as fast as you hoped it was.
Well, again, the Office of Budget Responsibility will do their forecast.
Well, they'll do that. Well, I'm just... never mind the forecast. Let's look at what's happened already. Inflation's not coming down at the rate you hoped it was. Interest rates are being held. They're not coming down. The growth figures are absolutely flat. And per capita growth is actually falling. Are you being a bit complacent about where we are now?
I know that we need to go further and faster in delivering economic growth and seeing public services improve. But there are no shortcuts here. It's the hard yards that are necessary.
But if you want to do people to do the hard yards, you have to convince them, surely, that the situation demands it. And what we're hearing this morning from you, I'm afraid, is one that says, actually, it's kind of OK, don't worry too much.
Things have changed since the general election. We've had cuts in interest rates, not hikes in interest rates, and wages are rising faster than inflation. That was not the case in the previous Parliament, which was the worst on record for living standards. But are you saying, do we need to do more to grow the economy, to address the cost of living crisis? Absolutely, we do. That is why we are reducing bureaucracy and regulation. It's why we are reforming the pension system to bring more money into the economy and so much more.
I want to come to what you're going to do, but I just want to get clear on what you think the problem you're solving is. Has the economy declined, got worse, more difficult since you came to office or not?
The economy is not growing fast enough. I'm not satisfied with the numbers that we see at the moment.
It's not growing at all. The last month was 0.1. OK, it's gone up and down a bit, but it's basically flat on its back.
And it's not possible within just a few months to reverse more than a decade of economic stagnation. But we are making the changes that's necessary to get Britain building again, to bring money into the economy. The International Investment Summit that we hosted last year brought more than £60 billion of investment into the United Kingdom. Our commitment at the budget to spend £100 billion more on infrastructure during this Parliament, the creation of a national wealth fund to leverage in private sector money into our economy. The OECD predicted just last week that our economy will be the second fastest G7 economy in terms of growth next year. Yes, we do need to do more. Growth is the number one mission of this government. We're turning things around, but it takes hard work and there are no shortcuts to get there.
Let's talk about how much of the situation we're in is you and how much is the past. You routinely blame the Tories for the situation you're in, but business leaders routinely say that it was your pessimistic messages in the autumn that discouraged spending, your national insurance rise that halted hiring and depressed the economy. Honestly, looking back at it now, did you overdo the doom and gloom?
When I became Chancellor, we did inherit a £22 billion black hole in the public finances.
Much
I had
contested,
to take,
but anyway.
Well, the OBR set out that in the numbers they published last year. We have addressed that. It did require difficult decisions, particularly in terms of tax.
But that's not what I'm asking you about. The message you were giving, and the Prime Minister, through the autumn was, it's terrible, it's awful, we have to do all sorts of things. Did you overdo the pessimism?
No, we took the action that was necessary to ensure that our public services and public finances were on a firm footing. And the tax, the national insurance, the non-dom tax, the VAT on private schools, that money has been used to both secure the public finances and to put more than £20 billion into the National Health Service, which is why for 5 months in a row now we've seen NHS waiting lists decline. It's why from April we're beginning to roll out breakfast clubs, free breakfast clubs at every primary school to help working parents and give children the best start in life.
Forgive me for interrupting you.
That's what we've been able to deliver.
But those national insurance rises haven't actually kicked in yet. They're about to kick in now. Is that going to depress the economy further?
Well, look, the Office of Budget Responsibility will set out their forecast. I recognise that there are costs. Because it's them who do the forecast.
Because you're the Chancellor. And you've mentioned the OBR, I think, now 5 times. Who's running this country? Is it you or the OBR?
I make the policy decisions, but it is right that forecasting is done by someone else. I shouldn't be marking my own homework, and I'm not going to be doing that. Unlike the previous government, I've got respect for those independent economic institutions. But, Trevor, your question is, do tax increases have an impact on the economy? Of course they do. But imagine if I'd have done something else last October. Imagine if I'd have swept the problems under the carpet and said everything was fine. Then today, when we face the aggression from Russia, we wouldn't have the additional money to spend on defence. We would be in a situation where NHS waiting lists will continue.
It's not additional money. You took it out of overseas aid. It's not additional money. You took it out of the international aid budget.
Yes, we made that decision, but if the public finances weren't on a firm footing, we'd have to be raiding budgets to prop up the public finances. Instead, we were able to redirect money from international development to defence spending, and the Bank of England have had the confidence to cut interest rates 3 times since the general election. That would not have been possible unless I had delivered a budget that brought stability back to the economy. And I'll make no apologies for doing that, because it's not the wealthy and the most privileged who lose out when the economy is unstable. It's ordinary working people and ordinary businesses who see the costs of borrowing go up, who see that uncertainty in the economy having a direct impact on their living standards. I have returned stability to the economy, and that was the right thing to do.
Let's talk about what you are actually going to do next. It's reported that you want to cut civil service costs by 10%. What is it that civil servants are doing now that we don't really need to have done? And can you give an example of a task done by humans that's going to be done completely by AI?
Yeah, there's a number of briefing roles that can now be done by technology. Business use technology and AI much more than we do in the public sector. And it's one of the reasons why in the zero-based review that every department is doing at the moment.
But principally as an aid, not as a replacement for human capabilities.
Well, actually, a bit of both. I mean, for example, in departments like His Majesty's Revenue and Customs and DWP, we're rooting out fraud in part by using technology much better. That's a really good example of how we are using technology to deliver better public services at lower cost to the taxpayer. Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, announced the abolition of NHS England, the biggest quango
he was
in the
here
world,
last week telling me about that.
employing more than 15,000 people. We can make efficiencies there. We can do the same work with less people if we reduce that duplication. We've already taken out 2 regulators because we don't think we need them.
Yeah, you took out 2 regulators, but you've invented another 27.
That is just not the case. We've taken out 2 regulators. That's been welcomed by business, and it would also reduce the cost of running the state. But NHS England, 15,000 people today, often duplicating the work that the Department of Health doing. I want money spent on the front line, not on bureaucracy.
How many civil servants are you going to get rid of?
Well, what we've done is not a civil servant target, but an admin target. So that also targets consultancy spend, for example.
How many people are going to lose their jobs?
Well, it will be up for every department to set out those plans. But I would rather have people working on the front line in our schools and our hospitals and our police rather than in back office jobs. So this isn't just about...
No, but you have to be straight with people. How many civil servants are going to lose their jobs in broad terms? OK, I'm not asking you for, 532 or 5,027. But broadly speaking, is it 5,000? Is it 10,000? Is it 15,000?
We've said a 10 to 15%, 15% by the end of the Parliament, reduction in admin budgets. In admin budgets. So that includes consultancy, it includes travel budgets, it includes communications budgets. So it doesn't all have to be about people. But when we make those savings...
It's going to be about people. And when you can't say this is going to be pain-free.
No, but what I am saying is it will deliver better public services, because I would rather we had people employed by the NHS working in our hospitals rather than in a government department. So this is about doing things differently and putting money where people see it most. During COVID...
This is what people say about politicians. I ask you a question that says, broadly speaking, how many roles are going to get lost? I cannot believe that you're telling your colleagues we need to take 10% out without any idea how many of those are going to be actual jobs. I just cannot believe that that's what you're doing.
I'm confident that we can reduce civil service numbers by 10,000. And during COVID, there were big increases in the number of people who were working in the civil service. That was the right thing to do to respond to those challenges. But it's not right that we just keep those numbers there forever, because they haven't been cut back since COVID, despite the fact that the world has changed since then. And I don't want money spent on bureaucracy and back office functions. I want those staff on the front line, teaching our kids, working in our hospitals, delivering those frontline public services.
Is it true that Chief Secretaries asked some departments to model budget cuts of over 5% and 11%?
We've asked departments to do a zero-based review, and so to rank all of their spending from the most vital to the least important. And it's through that exercise that we've made decisions to take out regulators. It's through that exercise that we've made decisions to get rid of NHS England, and we will continue to use that to make sure there hasn't been a zero-based review of government spending since 2007.
I was asking about departmental budgets.
Yes, so we've asked every department to rank their spending from the most important to the least important.
So you haven't said, give us a picture of a 5% cut or 11% cut. You simply... The zero-based budgeting is a whole different exercise.
Well, we've asked them to rank every line of their expenditure, from the most important, so you can see what the top 1%, the top 2%, and indeed the least important 1%, 5% and 20% of spending. And then we will ask departments, well, with a budget, would you rather spend more on your priorities or would you rather continue the budgets as they are today? Because I think it is really important that we evaluate everything that we do, because in the end, this is the money of ordinary working people and ordinary businesses, and it hasn't been evaluated since 2007. I am absolutely convinced we can get better value for money for all of the taxes that are paid into the system.
But I'm not entirely clear. You're asking people to tell you, what their priorities are, but you haven't told me whether that's for the purpose of just saying, this is interesting, we might move the money around, or for the purpose of deciding where you're going to cut spending. Are there going to be spending cuts?
There will be real-term spending increases in every year of this Parliament. Real-term spending increases in every year of this Parliament. But as a government, we have to decide where that money is spent. And we want to spend it on our priorities. We set out a plan for change at the election about reducing waiting.
What is not clear is, when you put forward the budget, you were talking about real terms increases, I think something above 1%, 1.3%, I believe it was. Is that what is going to be the case for the rest of the Parliament, or will the spending increases be lower than that 1.3%? I'm trying to work out what is actually going to happen.
We'll set out all of that in the spending review, including with the departmental allocations in June. But what I can tell you, Trevor, is that in every single year of this Parliament, there will be real terms increases in government spending. But of course, as a government, we will allocate the money to the areas where we think we can get most bang for the buck, where we can deliver on the priorities of the British people, which is improving living standards, reducing NHS waiting lists, making sure that every kid gets the best start in life.
We've had a pretty thorough discussion about this. On almost everything you said to me, it is, well, I can't tell you how many jobs go.
I just did, Trevor.
Yeah, eventually. You told me 10,000.
Well, because the target is not a civil servant number target.
But the point is, it sort of feels like what you want to do is to say, it's all going to be tough, but actually there's not really going to be too much pain for anybody. It just feels like you're not being entirely straight with us.
Well, if you work for NHS England, a lot of those jobs will go. Okay. But if you work on the front line in public services, we won't put more money in there. In the budget, because of the difficult decisions that I took on taxation, we were able to put more than £20 billion into the NHS. That's the priorities of this government, and those are the priorities of the British people, and we're delivering against them. Okay. But are we going to do everything the same? No, we are not. We are going to change how government works. We're going to rewire the state and put money into priorities, not just keep on doing what the previous government did.
Welfare, well, let's not go. Just no interview with a senior government minister can go past without a question about Mr. Donald Trump. What impact do you expect the Trump tariffs to have on our economy?
Well, we want to avoid tariffs, and we are working on an economic agreement at the moment. Well, wait a second. I've got a little bit more confidence in our negotiators, and we're working to get a deal with the United States. We're working quickly on that. When our Prime Minister, when Keir Starmer met Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump, the US President, said that he wanted to work on a deal, and that's what we are now doing. I believe in free and open trade. I want to reduce tariffs, not increase them.
You're expecting us to escape the fate of Mexico, Canada, most of the EU, and that we'll be the only people he won't slap tariffs on.
Well, let's see what happens. I don't want tariffs. British businesses don't want tariffs. It results in higher prices and less choice for people in the shops. So we are working to try and ensure that we can continue the free and open trade. There are 1 million British people working for American firms. There are 1 million Americans working for British firms. We have balanced trade with the US, no surplus, no deficit. We want to keep it that way.
Chancellor, pleasure talking to you as always.
Thank you.
Well, let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the political editor of The Spectator, soon to be the US editor of The Times, Katie Balls, the broadcaster Daisy McAndrew, and the chief leader writer of The Observer and The Guardian columnist Sonia Soda. Katie, that was upbeat Rachel today. She was quite robust. What do you think she has to do on Wednesday with this spring statement?
Well, it was never meant to be a particularly big event, the spring statement. The idea is you have the budget in the autumn, and this was just to almost say, well, here are how things look. And unfortunately for the Chancellor, because the economy has deteriorated, because she left herself some headroom, but not enough headroom, we're now expecting to see that event have two pieces of bad news. One being that the growth forecast is going to be slashed. And secondly, that her headroom may no longer exist. So therefore, she needs to find some more headroom, which is where you get into these cuts on civil service, some of the welfare reform. So I think she needs to show that she has, show to the markets that she has a plan, but also through that plan of cutting things, keeping her party on side about enough to get through it.
I want to come to the party, but Daisy, did you hear a plan there?
I heard a lot of sort of, it's not me, Gov, we're doing our best. Look at the inflation figures, which always sounds very shallow just before, a sort of mini fiscal event like this. I think she's really struggling. I think she's struggling for both important constituencies. As you said, we were going to talk about the party being very important, the Labour Party, but also the financial markets, who I'm not sure are buying what she's selling. So I think she certainly is in a much weaker position than she was a few months ago. And you can see the shark circling around her and her popularity plummeting.
What do you think, Sonia? Is she on her own here, or is it still number 10 and number 11 working together?
I think it's still number 10 and number 11. I think the issue is that when you look at where the criticism is coming from within the party when it comes to spending cuts, it's not just usual suspects. So it's usually loyal MPs, backbench MPs, who are particularly unhappy about disability cuts. You've got people like David Blunkett, hardly from the left of the party, saying, actually, this is a point where the Chancellor needs to stop thinking about cutting spending and thinking about rewriting the fiscal rules as they are in Germany. You've got other people saying, well, let's look at tax rises instead. And I think that's the key thing here. The Chancellor wants to say, look, I've got no real choice apart from cutting spending. And it is inevitable that those spending cuts are going to hit the most vulnerable in society the worst, I think. That's what we're starting to see. But there are others in the party who say, but that's not the only option. You could relax your fiscal rules, or you could actually, for example, freeze tax thresholds for the next couple of years. Painful, but maybe it's better than some disabled people losing up to £10,000 a year.
I'm quite surprised, actually, that there's nothing, but we may hear something on tax thresholds. Let's talk about what we understand that she's going to do. 10,000 out of 500 civil servants. Daisy, does this amount to rewiring the state, as the phrase that we keep hearing?
No, and it's always such an easy lever for politicians to pull, because civil servants losing their jobs never gets any public sympathy. It's not, as she was very keen to say, she'd rather see nurses have these jobs rather than civil servants, but it's easy. And when you actually get down to it, it's not that easy. It's easy to sell, but it's very difficult to actually do. And it's that sort of headline-grabbing number that you know that you're going to get picked up on, but actually in the future, when we look back, I absolutely guarantee it won't end up happening.
Well, you say it's headline grab. It took 6 goes for me to get a 10,000 figure out. I'm not quite sure why she just didn't say it's 10,000, because actually it strikes me as a classic piece of Starmerism, which is big problem, massive catastrophe, massive difficulty. Here's a tiny 10,000 is what, 1 point a bit percent?
Yeah, the savings.
1.7%.
Yeah, the savings are, and it's the same when you look at the NHS, for example. So they've announced that they're abolishing NHS England and bringing Department of Health and NHS England together. You know, that might be 10,000 jobs as well. In the scale of the NHS budget, it is really incremental, which makes you start to feel like some of this may just be a bit more presentational. The other thing is, of course, is that there's not a lot of public sympathy for civil servants losing jobs. That's true, but if that's 10,000 from the civil service in general, some people think it could be another 20,000 job cuts from NHS England and regional integrated care boards. These are actually starting to be a fair number of jobs as well. People with mortgages to pay, kids in school, and that's a lot of people to be losing jobs.
I think on the one hand, you obviously have figures in number 10 who really want to talk up the idea that this is now an insurgent government and they are, tearing things down from the inside. You have these, they will compare themselves sometimes to Dominic Cummings, for example, with that diagnosis of the state is not working. And that's because they think if you're taking on the Reform Party and others, you can't look like you're part of the problem. you have to look as though you're changing things from the inside. But then, as you say, you look at some of these numbers, and this radical solution is actually fairly small fry in places. I mean, even the benefits changes, the welfare reforms. Obviously, as Sonia said, there's lots of Labour MPs who think they're cruel and unhappy, but if you look at the numbers of savings compared to the ballooning welfare bill, it's still fairly minimal in terms of what you're going to be left with on costs for the taxpayer.
I think it's interesting that you're mentioning reform. A lot of people saying that Rachel Reeves has got until the autumn, and it'll depend on how well reform does between now as whether she'll keep her job.
OK, well, we'll no doubt talk a bit more about the politics of this, but clearly it's nothing like what's happening where you're going, where there's a bloke with a chainsaw taking the axe or taking a chainsaw to civil service. It is now 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Chancellor's told this programme that she's confident the government can cut 10,000 civil service jobs to save money. Rachel Reeves said she totally rejected a new report saying living standards would fall across the Parliament and said, wait and see on US tariffs on the UK. Well, a lot more to come this morning. Shortly, we'll get the Conservatives' take on the upcoming spring statement and our interview with Rachel Reeves. The Shadow Chancellor Mel joins us any second. And we'll also have reaction from Westminster's third party, the Liberal Democrats' Deputy Leader and Treasury Spokesperson Daisy Cooper is live later in the hour. The current government often blames the last lot for many of their problems, so let's get the view from the Conservatives now. A little earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride. Mel Stride, if it's true that the government plans to send failed asylum seekers to a third country in the Balkans, would you support that in principle?
Well, we need to look at it closely. Whilst it is for failed asylum seekers, it is nonetheless very similar to the kind of arrangements that we were bringing in around Rwanda, which, of course, the current government scoffed at and said would never work. My view was that they pulled that far too early. We had flights ready to go off in July, so we never saw the actual effect of that happening, other than the fact that we saw a number of asylum seekers actually leaving Northern Ireland to escape our jurisdiction at that time and various changes. So deterrence works. But it's interesting they've come back to the kind of territory that we were in, which they said was the wrong thing to do.
So if they bring us to the House of Commons and say, this is what we're going to do, we've accepted the principle of deterrence, you guys are going to line up behind them?
Well, we'll have to look at any particular approach in detail before coming to a firm conclusion. And, of course, we don't know the form in which any of those votes, if there are any, are put before the House, so we'll have to consider that at the time. But my point is, Trevor, this is important. They talked down what we did with Rwanda. They do now seem to be moving in that kind of direction. Now, there's a certain irony there, and also the fact that, of course, by cancelling Rwanda, they wasted a huge amount of money.
OK, well, it's so interesting. When you're in government, everybody... things that you wanted in government in opposition don't look quite so attractive, it seems. But anyway, let's talk about the spring statement. Your boss, Kemi Badenoch, promised last autumn to, I'm quoting here, make Rachel wriggle. You've already come out this morning criticising her before she's said anything much. Just as a matter of good manners, don't you think, given that much of what she's got to deal with is your doing or your party's doing, a period of silence might be in order from the Tories?
Well, we've had various things to say about the past, but we're now looking ahead with this government coming to the House of Commons on Wednesday with what will be an emergency budget, effectively. It won't just be reading out the figures from the OBR. There'll be major announcements that will have to be made, and they will have to be made because the government has not gripped the economy. So the first thing that Rachel Reeves and the government did on coming into office was to talk down the economy. They came up with this fictitious black hole of 22 billion that the OBR themselves says they won't legitimise.
Well, you said it's fictitious.
Well, the OBR said, and I'm using their language, they will not legitimise that figure. So they have looked at it in detail. But look, also what they've done is they've slapped huge amounts of taxes on businesses. They've borrowed vast amounts of money across the forecast period. That has pushed inflation up higher than it would otherwise be. That has meant interest rates being higher for longer, so interest rates will be coming down more quickly had they not taken those decisions. And that has impacts for the public finances because of our debt servicing costs, and also for mortgage holders and others.
I'm hearing the critique. What I'm not hearing is any acceptance of responsibility for the situation that they and we are in on behalf of your party, which was in government for 14 years.
So look, I think across that 14 years, there were many things that the Conservative Party did that were absolutely right, not just around the economy, for example.
Say absolutely wrong there. I was hoping that you might admit that there was something that you didn't do right.
Jobs. Look, there were things. Net migration was certainly one of them that we've already touched on, and Kemi has had a number of things to say about that. But look, we got us through COVID, and we got us through the inflationary pressures that came to our shores because of the war between Ukraine and Russia, and we supported the economy through that. On the day of the general election, we had just had the fastest growth.
More of a hearing if, for once, you guys were to say, you know what, we made some mistakes. The trust budget, some of our migration, yes, but some of our decisions on spending and so on, much higher. The disability benefits bill ballooned during your time. Wouldn't it give you more of a hearing if you for once admitted, actually, you made some mistakes?
So Trevor, on the so-called mini-budget, I was then chair of the Treasury Select Committee, and I had a lot to say about it before it happened, when it happened, and since it happened. And that is a situation that this party will never, ever repeat. So I will make sure that by the time we get to the next general election, the electorate are very confident that we believe in sound money, in prudence when it comes to the public finances, and that we will make sure the economy is kept in a sustainable and good place. And it's as simple as that. Now, just very quickly, though, the inheritance that this government had was the fastest growing economy in the G7, almost record levels of employment, near record low levels of unemployment. We'd had real wages rising for 13 consecutive months. And we brought that inflation that came to our shores because of the Russia-Ukraine war down from over 11% to bang on target at 2% on the day of the general election. It hasn't taken this government more than about 6 or 7 months to unwind all of that and put us in a position where actually growth is now stone dead.
Let me ask you about some of the decisions that the Chancellor might have to make. One of the things that, talking to the Chancellor this morning, that struck me is that she referred to the OBR several times and waiting for the OBR's forecast, working on the OBR's numbers and so on. If you were to return to government, would you reverse enshrining into law the OBR's powers? Because there are some people who are asking, who's really running the government now? Is it the Treasury or is it the OBR?
So I think it's important that we have a body that basically marks the government's homework, and that it's not left to chancellors to decide what the forecasts are going to be, because there's always a temptation then to be overly optimistic. That's not the same thing as saying that we shouldn't look at the way the OBR works. It's not the same thing as saying we shouldn't look at the way a number of these arm's length bodies work, the FCA, the PRA and others, and what their remit is.
These are financial regulators.
Those are financial regulators, exactly. So I think we need to start with a blank sheet of paper, but I think the principle of making sure there is an independent, robust assessment of the Chancellor's figures and fiscal interventions and so on is an important and sound principle.
All right. This is the first time I've had an opportunity to talk to you since we heard Liz Kendall's statement on disability benefits and so forth. Your colleague Helen Whately, in responding to those proposals, said that they didn't go far enough. Who else would you be punishing to balance the books?
There's no question about punishing anybody, but there is a question here.
That's what withdrawal benefits does.
Well, no, I think what you said was that Helen said they don't go far enough, and they don't, and let me explain why. So if you are going to carry out welfare reform, you have a solemn duty to do it in a careful, thoughtful way, a principled way. And two of the key principles are, firstly, that you're fair to the taxpayer, and that means that we cannot afford to have these ever-spiralling welfare costs. And secondly, you have to do it in a way so that you look out for and look after the most vulnerable in our society. And what that tells you is the last thing you do is rush it. Now, what this government did was they fought shy of welfare reform. In fact, in the manifesto, they don't even mention personal independence payments, which is the main area that they've changed. They came into government, they fought shy of it. Why? Because it's a very divisive issue across the Labour Party. And then when Rachel Reeves suddenly discovered there was no money left and she was going underwater, the word went out that they would suddenly have to find savings,
and
it was rushed.
On what they're doing.
So my point, yes, and I'm coming to that. I'm coming to exactly that. Exactly that.
Okay.
So when you come to principled reform, rather than what I've just described that this Labour government has done in terms of scrabbling around, you can find greater savings and be fairer to people.
Where?
So on PIP, for example, we had already consulted when we were in government on reforms to personal independence payments, which included an array of different options, some of which we would have taken forward, which would have saved more money for this government. For example,
I'm just trying to get you to tell me.
Let's get detailed. It's a very detailed area.
Who's not going to get the money?
I'm very happy to say that. What this government has done is they've changed the assessment arrangements to get PIP. That's how they've made the savings. What we would have been looking at is a fundamental overhaul of PIP to make sure that rather than being a blunt instrument about providing cash almost irrespective of your condition or whether it continues on through time and so on.
In all of that,
we make it more targeted and we save more money. But you can't do it by rushing it.
When you say make it more... I'm just trying to get to understand what this means in the real world.
Yes.
Rather than policy speak. When you say make it more targeted, does that mean that you think that there should be fewer people getting PIPs?
What it means is that if you were on PIP, for example, and you had a mental health condition, a reformed PIP would quite possibly say, Trevor, rather than giving you amounts of money every year, we will actually provide you with treatment that will help you, and in particular, help you, for example, if you're not in work, to get into work. So a totally different approach, which would be better for you and better for the taxpayer.
I'm not hearing where the savings come out of that.
Well, if you get somebody who has a mental health challenge and you take them from being dependent upon cash payments through PIP into coming off those payments through treatment and into work, that is clearly an area of savings. That's a fundamentally different way of doing it, and that's not what this government's done. They've just simply said, we'll make it more difficult to get PIP, and that's interesting, because that's putting a lever that you do if you're
That's very interesting, because mental illness is the largest single benefit set of claims for people of working age. 47% of claims in that cohort are for mental health. So you're saying, actually, we'd basically take an axe to that.
No, I'm saying that there's a different way of helping people in that situation that's better for the taxpayer and equally better for them. And that's what principled welfare reform that's thoughtful and properly thought through should be about. Not scrabbling around at the last minute, pulling levers to save money because you're going to have to stand up in the House of Commons on Wednesday and explain why there's no money left.
Mel, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Back to our panel, Katie Balls, Daisy McAndrew and Sonia Soda. Daisy, I think I was maybe giving Mel Tried a bit of earache about the fact that I don't think anybody's hearing them, partly because they don't seem to want to admit that they made any mistakes. Am I being unfair?
I think you're completely right in your analysis that nobody's hearing what they've got to say. I'm not sure I agree that it's because they're not admitting previous mistakes. I think it's actually because they haven't got a lot to say at the moment. They've got a new leader, and normally when you have a newish leader, that person will come with a whole new bag of tricks and a whole new series of policies, and that's what they haven't got. So nobody really cares what they've got to say because we're not getting answers to the questions of, well, what would you do instead? And I do understand that after 14 years of government, Kemi Badenoch saying, I want to sort of rip everything up and start again, and therefore it's going to take me some time to come up with the ideas. But I think those around her are very frustrated by how long it's taking her.
Well, we are hearing a little bit more, aren't we, about, they're tough on welfare, they've sort of got a view about immigration, which is not so much about numbers, but about culture and all of that. But what do you think, Sonia?
So I worked for the Labour Party in Ed Miliband in 2010. So I know how hard it is to achieve cut-through when you've just lost a general election in a pretty spectacular way. And I actually happen to think there's not very much they can do at this stage. No one's interested in hearing from them because they were just broadly and roundly rejected by the electorate in a general election, less than a year ago. And people had it with the government. And you don't get that back in a year. You don't earn the right to be heard by voters within a year. So, I think Kemi Badenoch is struggling, actually, and she isn't performing as well as some on her backbenchers would like her to be, that's for sure. But, you know, being the leader of the opposition just after your government has been kicked out in quite a major way is not an easy job. And quite frankly, yes, you could do more of saying we got stuff wrong and we understand why you guys really don't like us anymore. But people aren't that interested in hearing that anyway. They're interested in hearing what's going to happen over the next 5 years. Am I going to feel better off in a couple of years? Because living standards have been stagnant over the last 20 years. That's what people are interested in, the here and now. Well, Tories don't have any power at the moment.
Indeed. I want to pause there for 5 seconds to absorb your trauma, Sonia. It's clear, after 15
to get it off my chest.
After 15 years, it's still with you. But coming on this point about living standards, let's have a look at the real measure here, which is GDP growth per head. I think it's really interesting. This the growth per head has shrunk in most quarters since the pandemic, and it feels as though there isn't that much that they could do, but there might be alternatives. I mean, what one of you mentioned earlier on, that instead of cutting benefits and so forth, they could, for example, freeze the thresholds on tax. Now, they've said they're going to freeze them till 2028, and maybe they could extend it to another couple of years, and that would bring in big money, wouldn't it?
It would, and it's effectively a stealth tax, so she could slightly argue that it doesn't, it's a grey area, it doesn't completely go back on what she said, which is, don't worry, guys, there won't be another big tax-raising budget, particularly not in a spring statement. But I think there is a concern within number 10 and number 11 that anything more on tax is just going to work against your plan for growth. And I think that, there is a question is, what was Labour's strategy for growth? Did they have one from the beginning? You obviously do have something in the way of some of these supply side planning. But I also think they thought that they could pitch themselves as a haven of stability, and confidence and the sense of having a really big majority would mean that businesses want to invest in the UK. And that's where I do think Rachel Reeves has to take a bit of the personal share of the blame here. And you can also look at the Tories and their time there. But I think number 11 will surprise themselves with the impact of talking down the economy and the fiscal black hole early on. And I think they thought that was the genius of taking the George Osborne playbook, and they were learning from this, and that was for a consumer audience, not quite realising what that would do in terms of the business side of it. And when you speak privately to figures now, they will say that they think they went a bit too far in it.
One of the things that's knocked them off the horse is the borrowing, which is now pretty dramatic. I think we can pull that up. This is really striking, isn't it? That the idea was that there was going to be the OBR, which is figured heavily in the programme this morning. They said 87 billion forecast. They've actually borrowed 132 billion.
There is an issue here, I think, for Labour, which is that they went into the election basically saying to voters, vote for us and we'll fix the economy in 5 years and you will feel better off. That was quite an unrealistic pledge, I think. I think politicians of all colours have actually failed to front up with voters about the fact that the times of boom that we saw in the 2000s are over. Britain is now, we're not a leading global economy. We've got long-term structural issues that were exposed by the 2008 financial crisis. Living standards have stagnated by then. You can't fix these very long-term structural issues like low productivity in 3 years. You just can't do it. So I think Labour would have been better off, actually. It wouldn't have been quite so effective in electoral strategy, but they wouldn't have found themselves as hamstrung in government if they'd actually been honest with voters and said, look, our economy's got a lot of long-term issues, and in the medium term, there are even bigger things coming up. We've got an ageing population that means that actually today's teenagers, if we don't do anything, they're going to be paying a bigger share of tax just to keep public services standing still. Yeah. So there's a lack of honesty from all politicians, and I think Labour, it was tempting to say, elect us and we'll fix it, but it wasn't quite accurate.
I think lack of honesty is absolutely the crux of this. And we, as we went into that last election, it was completely dishonest of the Tories, their position, saying about the economy, as it was with Labour. Labour knew that there was this black hole. Everybody knew that there was this black hole, but nobody was prepared to admit it in the election. And then suddenly after the election, oh, look, we've opened the books and we've found this enormous black hole, so therefore we're going to have to do more dramatic things than we promised the electorate.
But we need to do a little bit of honesty with ourselves, aren't we? Because they tried the doom and gloom thing in the autumn, and we all went after them for depressing the economy.
Yes, but I think when you go back to the Osborne playbook, which was, let's blame the Tories on this fiscal black hole, David Cameron and George Osborne talked about the argument for austerity before the election, and they laid the groundwork in a way that I don't think Labour did in this situation. They tried to do it after getting the votes, and I think that has made life more uphill for Rachel Reeves. And there is a trade-off on votes if you take that risk, of course, but perhaps she needed to go a little bit more on that.
And yet she's also, tied her hands behind her own back by promising no big tax rises, no national insurance, and so on and so forth. So she's scrabbling down the back of the sofa looking for pennies.
Let's talk about the political risk here. Cut international aid, cut welfare benefits, don't lift the two-child cap. I mean, with the fuel allowance, you can just... Is this what all those Labour MPs in that vast majority thought they'd signed up for?
Well, as we said in our Observer editorial this morning, Labour needs to rediscover its moral backbone and fast. And at the moment, the forecast is that child poverty will go up by 400,000 children over the first term of this Labour government without significant policy change.
Chancellor said
before. Yeah, but that's from independent think tanks who I trust a lot more than a Chancellor who's got to come on your show and pretend that everything's all right. That's before the welfare cuts. Labour MPs are not going to be happy going out at the next election and defending a record where child poverty has gone up by 400,000 or potentially even more children. That is the political problem they've got. Now, they've got a very big majority, so I do think they're going to be able to get this stuff through. It's just that there are going to be some very, very miserable MPs going into the next election.
Next, we'll get the view from the Liberal Democrats with Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We start with breaking news. An historic day here today.
The golden age of America begins right now.
A long-awaited ceasefire is now underway.
First question, Sky News.
This is a huge moment.
It's incredible.
Now to California.
Do you owe citizens an apology? Have you nothing to say?
Jane Secker, Sky News. Would you like to respond to us now?
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
In principle, would you agree to do that?
Criticism of you is banned. How is this a fair election?
The cameras are poised, waiting to see what the president might do next.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted, she was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone, and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
we've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News. We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast. It's starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Let's turn to the third biggest party in Parliament now, the Liberal Democrats. Often more fond of telling us what they'd spend than what they'd cut or raise. Let's see what they make of the government's plans and what they might do differently at this spring statement. I can speak now to the party's Deputy Leader and Treasury Spokesperson, Daisy Cooper. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can I just start with the issue of asylum seekers? If it's true that the government plans to send failed asylum seekers to a third country in the Balkans, would you oppose that?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear that question. Can you repeat that?
I was asking you, if it is true that the government plans to send failed asylum seekers to somewhere in the Balkans, would you oppose that plan?
Well, we haven't seen the details of any kind of plan like that. We Liberal Democrats have always said that people who are fleeing war and persecution should have the ability to apply to come to the UK through a safe and legal route. But what's clear is that we used to have returns agreements in place to return people to the first country that they entered. That was scrapped under the Conservatives. And so if the government is going to bring forward any proposals to reintroduce something of that kind, then clearly we will scrutinise it when it comes forward. But clearly we need to look at the details of which particular countries they're talking about and under what circumstances.
But as a matter of broad principle, these would be failed asylum seekers. And presumably the aim is not to have to put them up in hotels at some vast cost every year.
Well, it is an absolute scandal that under the last Conservative government, so many people were stuck clogged up in the asylum process, and that it's been at enormous cost to the taxpayer, putting people in hotels in the UK. So clearly we'll look at other options. We need to see the plans that the government's going to bring forward, and we'll scrutinise them in detail. But as I say, we haven't yet heard anything from the government about having safe and legal routes to reduce the number of people that would be applying to come here in the first place. And we would like to see that as part of a broader package.
All right, well, you've heard this week what the government wants to do on welfare benefits. Do you support their proposal to reduce the welfare benefit bill?
Well, I think all politicians of all political stripes can support the idea that we want to see more people getting into work if they're able to work. But we are deeply concerned that from reports that the Labour government appears to be lining itself up to potentially put savage cuts in place for disabled people who need vital support at the expense, whilst giving out a tax cut to Elon Musk and other US tech barons at the same time. I think if the government is intending to do
Musk
that...
getting, by the way? What is the tax cut that Elon Musk is getting?
Well, if reports are to be believed, it sounds as though the Labour government might be looking to cut the digital services tax, which is a tax that is implemented on 20 of the largest online social media sites and search engines that operate here in the UK. And if the government is looking to reduce that digital services tax, whilst also implementing savage cuts on disabled people, then quite frankly, I think the Labour government is at real risk of losing their moral compass.
Yeah, but the digital services tax, as I understand it, actually from the OBR, who we hear from a lot on this programme, will raise less than £1 billion a year. I mean, it's not really that significant. It's not like they're going to increase Elon Musk's wealth to a degree that he would notice it. So let's just come back to the actual point, which is Do you think that their proposals to reduce welfare benefits were right and necessary? She's got to raise, we think, something like £10 billion each year, and that she can do that from taxes, from borrowing, or from cuts. Which one of those are you choosing?
Well, we Liberal Democrats have said that there are alternative levers that the government can pull. There are these big tech companies, there are the big banks, there are the big gaming companies, all of whom are making billions of pounds in profits. And it would be possible to increase taxes on those big corporations, which wouldn't make a huge difference to them, as you said yourself, but would raise vital amounts of money to put our public services back on their feet. At the same time, we also need to grow our economy, and we haven't seen any plan from this government to genuinely grow our economy. We Liberal Democrats have said that actually we think the government should be renegotiating the trade deal we have with the EU to get rid of the red tape, unleash the potential of our small businesses who can trade more easily with Europe. That would boost growth, and we can raise revenue from these big corporations as well.
If I may say so, it's quite nice to be able to say, let's raise money from big business and so on and so forth. But, you know, the banks already are being taxed. Businesses are paying extra on national insurance. There's a tax on gaming companies, a special tax on them. There are windfall taxes on energy companies. What's the new tax that the Liberal Democrats want to whack on businesses?
Well, on the big banks, for example, we've simply said that we would reverse the tax cut that the Conservatives gave to the big banks and reverse the bank levy to the 2015 level. So it's a level of tax that the big banks have paid before, and we wouldn't be going above that. On the digital services tax, at the moment it's only 2%, a 2% tax, one of the lowest digital services taxes that exists around the world. Some other countries have it as high as 7.5%. We think it could be increased to up to 10%. It still wouldn't have a massive impact
from 2%
on the profits
to 10%.
of these big US tech giants, but it would raise yes, and that would be a way of almost completely funding the increase in our defence spending. It would raise billions of pounds in money that, as you say and others would recognise, would not be a huge imposition on those massive US tech companies that are making billions of pounds in profits, but it would raise that vital money for our public services. Those are the choices that we Liberal Democrats would make.
So your position would be there is a hole to be filled. We're not going to fill it by cutting public expenditure or sacking civil servants or cutting benefits. We're not going to borrow more, but what we are going to do is to quintuple the tax levels on big tech companies. That's going to do it.
Well, as I say, there are a number of different ways in which you could raise additional revenue. We've pointed to reversing the Conservatives' tax cut for the big banks. We've talked about increasing the tech tax on the big 20 US tech firms. We've talked about increasing remote gaming duty. We've also talked about reforming capital gains tax in a way that is much fairer than the way the Labour government has done it, and in a way that would raise a lot more money from the 0.1% richest people. So there are many ways in which the government could be looking to raise additional revenue through taxing those people who, with very broad shoulders, who can afford to pay more without putting taxes on families that are really struggling with the cost of living, or on small businesses that are struggling with the cost of business as well.
OK, I don't have a view about this, but I just want to give you the chance to deal with the point. You've mentioned Elon Musk, I think, 3 times already. Have the Liberal Democrats got it in for Elon Musk because he called your leader a snivelling cretin?
It's nothing to do with that insult. Those of us who are in politics have had probably insults worse than that. The point is...
But you haven't mentioned any other business yet.
Well, I'm happy to mention Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos as well, if you like. But the point remains, we have these 20 really large tech companies. In many respects, we think that they are causing huge damage to young children through their failure to properly self-regulate on their social media sites. But we do also recognise that Elon Musk is an ally of Donald Trump and is a supporter of him. And we think that strategically and politically, if we need to increase our defence spending in this country, which we support, and we Liberal Democrats have called for increased spending on defence, we have suggested that one of the ways that you could increase spending on defence would be to increase this digital services tax, because obviously some of these allies are supporting Donald Trump, and we Liberal Democrats are keen to stand up to Donald Trump and make sure we stand up for Britain's interests and for European security.
All right, I'm pretty sure Mr. Musk will have heard that. Look out for a response on X. Thank you, Daisy Cooper, for your time this morning.
Thank you.
In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
Katie Balls, Daisy Andrew and McAndrew and Sonia Soda are still with us this morning. Let's just talk about the longer term point you raised earlier, Sonia. Here's the picture of growth per head in this country since the 1970s. Now, none of you can remember the 1970s, but I can. I was there. And what's really interesting is that was the decade of the three-day week. It was the oil shock. It was rubbish in the streets, winter of discontent. Growth per head, 2.5%. Yeah. Down to now, 2020s, 0.3%. And this, by the way, the reason it's really interesting to me is that the 2020s is the first decade in which the growth, 0.3%, is lower than the rise in the population, which at the moment is over this decade is 0.7%. In most decades, in all decades before this, the average growth per head has been ahead of the population growth, which means living standards rise. We're in trouble now. Is this a long-term... Is this something we just got to live with, Sonia?
Well, I think it's something that it's quite difficult to fix, because what's interesting is what sits beneath this. And it goes to some of those factors that I was talking about, the long-term structural issues in our economy, which is that we've had decades of low business investment, very sluggish productivity growth. That's what's been driving these stagnant living standards. We used to have a city and a financial services sector that before the financial crash kind of masked all those ills in our economy and made us feel like we were doing quite well. And under the new Labour years, essentially what happened was you had rising tax revenues powered by the city. So you had a lot of redistribution going on towards low-income parents with children. So none of this felt very painful, these long-term structural issues, because there was sort of a cover for it all, a foil for it all. And the financial crisis left the UK horribly exposed. I think we've since then made it a lot worse through Brexit. Literally, if you're a country that's got structural productivity issues, the last thing that you would do is seek to erect some quite painful trade barriers with your nearest and biggest trading bloc.
But it is what it is.
It is what it is, but you've got to think about what explains these figures. So, and the reason why I mention that is there aren't really any easy fixes on Europe now either. So, you know, we hear some MPs say, well, we should move closer to Europe. Well, yeah, absolutely we should. But unless we rejoin the single market and the customs union tomorrow, some of the stuff that we're talking about doesn't really add very much to growth. So these things are difficult to fix. You can see that, you know, Rachel Reeves had a number of investment measures, growth measures in her autumn budget. The OBR sort of said, well, we think in the long term this is going to, you know, add less than a percentage point to GDP. So it's very difficult to fix this stuff. So, yes, I think we do have to live with it.
Except that the new fashionable phrase, by the way, now, you're going to hear a lot of this in America, abundance liberalism, or what I think used to be called supply-side measure, basically improving the infrastructure, training people more and all the rest of it, and that's what is going to motor the economy. Rachel's version of it is more green technology, green industries and so on. Have they got a hope, Daisy, with that?
Well, I mean, Sonia's absolutely right. We have a lot of structural issues with our economy, but we also have demographics and inequality that's not spread around the country fairly. You know, that's where all the levelling up issues came from in the last Parliament that were suddenly swept under the carpet and disappeared. And one of the other problems that Rachel Reeves got with this is the ageing population. She's getting, as the baby boomers now become pensioners, she's going to be getting 800,000 new pensioners every year. Well, that brings down a standard of living because we've got fewer and fewer young people in work in order to pay for those old people who are now retiring. So all of these structural issues are also creating
I think
this sluggish economy.
I don't know this, but I think dependency ratio has gone down from above three workers for every pensioner down to something like 2.5
which is a big issue.
Equation makes the current fiscal issues look like child's play. The fiscal issues we've got coming 30 years down the track are much bigger.
I think when you also look at what the marginal tax rate is on a young person these days, when you think about student debt and so forth, we're at risk of not just having, an exodus of the rich when they don't like what's happening with non-dom status. We're also potentially going to have a brain drain where some of our brightest young people are going to think, is this looking better for me, or should I? I don't know if I can as young anymore. All that bright. And something. But, you know, I think you put all these things together, and I think ultimately, without economic growth, the UK is heading to lots of really unpalatable decisions. We spent the show talking about the spring statement. Of course, it's a spending review in the autumn, in the summer, around June, that is really leading to lots of ministers talking about the return of austerity. But given we can't borrow like Germany, really, which recently did in terms of that big borrowing to spend on defence. Germany's economy is in a better place in terms of borrowing than the UK's.
The Germans are borrowing at 2.something%, whereas we're borrowing at 4.5%.
Exactly, and you look at that to borrowing rates. The UK is just not in a position to do that really without suddenly having all these extra fees on servicing the debt, which makes the situation even worse. Tax rises are potentially going to go the other way, and therefore it could be the case that these planning reforms bring something. If they don't, then it's just going to get worse and worse, not just for the Labour government, but any government that follows.
Can I just quickly ask you, one of you anyway, my own personal obsession, why are we stuck with this triple lock?
Oh, I couldn't agree.
Favouring rich old people and not helping young people.
Yeah, that was exactly
What's the politics of that?
Where I was going with this 800,000 extra pensioners a year. The triple lock is a nonsense, and it's a political. I mean, you know what the answer is. The answer is because old people vote. It's as simple as that. It's not. It doesn't make sense to have the triple lock on any other margin apart from politically with a big P.
Yeah.
OK, all you old people who have a go at me on X on this, I know, I've heard the story. I'm still not convinced. Anyway, in a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
First Minister, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Nice to see you. How are you feeling?
Looking forward to getting into the parliamentary chamber.
Are you any further forward to making a decision?
No, it's an important day today.
All of the claims were in line with my parliamentary duties, so I'm making that clear to you, Conor.
He was a Scot through and through.
He was a very good politician.
Alex Salmond was controversial, he was a disruptor, but above all, he was respected.
Will you resign if you lose this week?
Again, I'm not planning to, of course, lose the vote of no confidence. I'm planning to win that vote of no confidence.
His face said it all.
My intention to stand down as party leader.
This is now a storm with deadly consequences. How are they feeling?
They're a bit scared at the minute.
We've been told to evacuate. How are you feeling?
Devastated.
Hundreds of homes were wiped out by flooding. I'm Conor Gillis, Sky's Scotland correspondent.
It was probably the darkest time in my life.
Scott is 5 years sober after a cocaine addiction left him close to death.
Scotland has a shameful record, worse than England, the worst in Europe.
Why not just say you failed? Because then you might get more respect from families who've lost loved ones. This is where one of the UK's most prolific rapists thought he'd got away with murder.
Sky News can reveal that former sex workers had told police he was sexually violent.
My Emma.
Free wherever you get your news. It's over, isn't it?
The Americans say he is Rossi, a fraudster.
This has been one of the most bizarre cases ever heard in a courtroom in this country.
A dangerous murderer.
Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Andrew Ennis after this?
She said she can forgive him, but as long as he's behind bars.
By doing the right thing, it's destroyed your life.
They terrorised me. They intimidated me.
Sky News, the full story first.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club.
4 more years!
Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, DC.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News. Back to our panel, Katie Balls, Daisy McAndrew and Sonia Soda. Rachel Reeves was very optimistic, Katie, that we somehow would escape the fate of every other country and not be subject to tariffs. What you're hearing from your colleagues in the United States, is that fantasy or is there something real there?
Well, you never know until it happens. And you have seen Donald Trump pull back because it's a last-minute agreement when it comes to a threat, tariffs or something else. And of course, the UK has said in response to the proposed tariffs at the beginning of April, and what I think in Whitehall they're calling World Tariff Day, is effectively that they're not planning to retaliate in the way that the Europeans are. So does that then leave the space for some of these conversations? You could pick up a little bit on that Daisy Cooper interview. Is there something the UK could do? When you speak to figures in Downing Street, they will praise DC figures and the Trump team for being quite transactional, which might not sound like a particularly beautiful thing to be, but it makes things quite simple. They say it's quite clear to deal with someone around Donald Trump because they are very upfront about, well, you do this and we will do this in response. So there's obviously some space, but I don't think she can bank on it.
But actually, it was very interesting, Daisy Cooper talking about the digital tax, because that's the thing that we know Peter Mandelson has confirmed that is on the table, that the Trump administration wants us to scrap that tax completely. So the Lib Dems were very unhappy about that. But it only raises 800 million, so it's not, in the great scheme of things, it's not that big a deal. But it's interesting that is clearly on the table, that's what they want the Labour government to do to get rid of that digital tax.
Sonia, are Labour MPs feeling a bit uncomfortable about the sort of bromance, semi-bromance, at least politeness with Donald Trump?
I think people are feeling fairly pragmatic about it. So, I think there's a feeling on the backbenches that actually when it comes to foreign policy, that is the area where Keir Starmer is excelling. He's played it in a very grown-up way. So, I think if you're the UK Prime Minister trying to be a bridge between Europe and the US, it's always a good sort of niche to put yourself in. Obviously, that changes a bit when it's Donald Trump because he's incredibly unpredictable. But no, I think the feeling on the backbench is, obviously people are uncomfortable with Donald Trump being President of the United States on the left of UK politics, given what's happened. But I do think that there's a feeling that Starmer is playing it well. I think that's in quite sharp contrast to some of the anger around domestic policy and disability cuts.
I always worry about this bridge metaphor, because my point about bridges is that they don't do anything; they just get walked on. And I just wonder whether we are in really being an actor, or whether we are basically just there while Putin and Trump carve up the world.
I mean, there's every chance that we're going to get used in this, right? There is that chance, but it's as strategies go. It's very hard to know what the right strategy is with somebody like President Trump. And I think if you look at the way that Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, has played it, he's been much more strident, right? But he's got more leverage because Canada supplies the US with a lot of its energy, for example.
And he's also got a lot more to lose.
Yeah, and a lot more to lose. So I do think that every leader has got to sort of play it in their own way. And my personal view is Starmer is probably playing it right from a UK perspective. Yeah.
We're hearing this morning that the White House reckons that there will be a chance of a ceasefire, likelihood of a ceasefire, and the date, they've given a date, April the 20th. Bloomberg is reporting that's what the White House is saying. And we're hearing that the Kremlin is saying that the phone call that Trump and Putin had is probably going to lead to a face-to-face meeting. That's pretty positive, don't you think, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a positive development and suggests that things are moving. Of course, the bigger question is, what does peace, and we can use inverted commas perhaps, look like in practice? What does a lasting peace look like? And where does this leave, from the UK perspective, Starmer's bridge in European countries? And I think that when you look at what happened, recently with that phone call, soon after you had the White House readout, and then you had the Russian readout, and they did appear to be in different places in part. And therefore, does Donald Trump, is he in a place where he is going to surprise, and actually his pledges that he was the one who could bring about an end to this are going to be true? And it might be that is the case. It's just that what an end to this looks like, I think there's a very decent chance of something a lot of Europeans and Ukrainians are very uncomfortable with and do not feel looks like peace or anything they would do. And you even had, Trump's key negotiator in an interview with Tucker Carlson the other day, criticising Keir Starmer slightly, for, his approach, and also talking about what many see as Russian talking points on territory. And if that's a flavour of where things are going, you can have what is nearing an end to a conflict, but it's going to leave many questions unanswered still.
And also, we know that Trump's playbook for his famous deal-making is that he will announce something when it's not in the bag at all as a way to push other players forward. I mean, that's what his sort of tried and tested policy. So I think a lot of these comments that are coming out of the White House need to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt at the moment.
Well, let's do what the educated class's favourite game is at the moment, which is to talk about Donald Trump. And let me do my job and, as it were, be not devil's advocate, but push forward the alternative view about Trump. Broadly speaking, people are very suspicious and so on. But I think Trump supporters would say that on the Middle East, on Ukraine, possibly even on the world economy, we've been in stasis for 3 or 4 years, and that actually we've been in gradual decline and so on. And what he's done is disrupted things in a way that actually makes something move. Might not necessarily be in the way that some of us want it, or some people want it, but it's changing.
Yeah, and we can already see a lot of politicians taking a leaf out of his book, using him as a sort of guinea pig of how to do things in a very dramatic, hitherto unthought, impossible manner, and copying a bit of this. We've seen a lot of politicians around the globe doing Trump, doing a sort of mini Trump, and I think that a lot of them have benefited from him being brave / reckless.
I mean, one of the things you could say when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, like if you were putting the best possible gloss on what he's doing, you could say that he's being more realist than Biden ever was, and that essentially what Biden was doing was arming Ukraine just enough to resist, but never to win. And that there is something realist about saying, right, we need to find some sort of negotiated settlement. The problem is, and maybe there's a little glimmer in there, but the problem is the way he's playing it. So, he basically made he's realigned the US to sort of come more into line with Russia's interests and Ukraine's interests, and the historic NATO alliance that America is meant to be a leader of. And he's basically given a load of concessions to the aggressor state, to Putin, before they even started talking. So you can definitely say he's a bit more realistic, but realist. But he has taken America off in a direction which I think is really unsavoury in terms of global alliances.
So, Katie, what's your mission there?
My mission, to try and report what's happening and find out what's happening. I think you can see, from the discussion today, can we just be so hard to work out where things are going to end up, or various people will try and say this is Donald Trump's mind, and very few people will know exactly. But I think from being there, obviously, you will get to know the movements, the politicians, and put it together in that sense. And I think on Ukraine, ultimately the point is we don't know. We can't judge until we've seen what the end result is. But everyone can agree the current situation is unsustainable.
We will be hearing from you, I'm sure, down the line. That's it from this week's show. I'll be back next Sunday. Pleasure to be with you as ever. Watch Sophie, 7 o'clock every evening.